April 3rd in 1984, the University Colloquium.
Welcome, musicians and would-be musicians. If you're like me, you're here to learn more about music. This is the Missouri Cultural Heritage Center's Colloquium series. Today we have a special treat that we've been looking forward to now for about a year, a chance to get Charlie Walden up here to show us what he's been doing with his fiddle project. This is one of the many activities of the Cultural Heritage Center that will in the future try to take account of some of the themes in the history of our state that we feel haven't really been very well attended to. And it's another one of those themes, it seems to me, old time fiddling, that is grossly understood by people who aren't well acquainted with it. We hear all sorts of fussing about folk fiddling versus violin playing. The instrument's precisely the same, of course, and there are many stereotypes about traditional fiddling that I think terribly misrepresent the authentic culture of our state and our region. And it looks like we have the Charlie Walden fan club here, including a few of the master fiddlers of the state, Taylor McBain, and looks like his sidekick, Barton Parra, there next to him. I guess, Kathy, when you grow up, did you want to be Taylor McBain? I don't know. I can think of no higher calling myself. I wanted to be Taylor McBain at a certain point and gave up. I could just barely play turkey in the straw, much less Marmaduke's hornpipe. But fiddling is one of the subjects that attracts a lot of interest around the state. There are many contests and many kitchen fiddlers like myself who just scratch and play for their own amusement. Charlie Walden is one of those rare young people who brings to me, I think, together both the interest of the serious amateur musician and the budding scholar. When I first met Charlie, he seemed to me, on the one hand, merely to be the best fiddle player I think I have ever seen under the age of 61. And then on the other hand, I learned very quickly that not only is Charlie an excellent musician, a person whose ear is finely tuned to the nuances of traditional playing, but he's a scholar in his own right. And like other scholars of folklore, he doesn't teach folklore courses at the university. He doesn't have any graduate degrees from these highfalutin universities like Indiana and Texas. He merely cherishes the music in a way that scholars can seldom know and can seldom appreciate, because it's his own culture, his own music, his own people, and for my money, that's my favorite kind of scholar. And we're interested in Charlie's forthcoming book. When is that going to come out, Charlie, by the way? We like Bob Christensen's book, but we're going to like yours a whole lot more, because it's going to be scholarly as well as present a lot of tunes. The last one of these series I want to mention to you is on May the 1st, and Susan Plotter of the History Department here will talk about state parks and historic sites. She's engaged in a very interesting project to study the history and development of the state park system that will lead to a publication and perhaps an exhibition. But today's special guest is Charlie Walden, who I'm pleased to call a friend of mine, as well as a damn good scholar of Missouri fiddling. Charlie Walden.
Well, I've got some prepared remarks on cultural conservation, and I can get through those in about 15 minutes if you promise not to ask me any questions. Otherwise, I might have to stumble around a little bit. At any rate, I want to talk a little bit about what cultural conservation is, and then after that, talk about what old-time fiddling is. Of course, looking out in the audience, I see lots of people who can justly be called good old-time fiddlers themselves, and so I hope I won't be repeating something you already know about it. And then after that, I'd like to take an accounting of things that have been done in Missouri thus far to preserve old-time fiddling and to conserve it and allow it to continue. again, if you hold questions on the cultural conservation stuff, and then feel free to ask me any question you want about fiddling. Once I get started talking about fiddling, just go ahead and ask me any question you want. I'm defending myself, in other words. Much of the language of cultural conservation comes from this, that I'm going to use, comes from this, what I think is a very excellent publication put out by the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress. It's a 1983 publication, and entitled Cultural Conservation, the Protection of Cultural Heritage in the United States. Basically what cultural conservation is I like to think of it as the flip side of one coin, which on one side is historic preservation, which deals with the tangible elements of culture like buildings and sites and districts and objects, artifacts, and the other side of that same coin is cultural conservation, which attempts to deal with and focus on the intangible elements, the things that don't exist as objects, but rather they exist as people's thoughts and actions and skills and so forth. And that's the focus of cultural conservation. Even though buildings and artifacts tell us about culture, I think they're just sort of evidence of culture. In a way, they're products of culture. Culture is a dynamic thing, and culture doesn't exist without people. If we look in the past at the evidence of early culture, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at evidence. Those cultures no longer exist. And so I think it's important now for us as Americans and as citizens to be aware of what our cultural heritage is, and that it's more than just buildings. And I don't want to say just buildings, because I think historic preservation is very important. But there's another side to that, which is all these intangibles that I want to talk about. Cultural conservation, then, is any activity which is directed at preserving the intangible elements of culture, or the intangible expression of culture. And another word often used to describe that is the word folklife. And I've got a definition written out here that I'll read to you. It includes beliefs, customs, rituals, dance, music, like I'm going to be talking about, crafts, occupational skills and techniques, art and literature, and then a qualifier is added, which have been handed down from one generation to the next, either orally or by imitation, and generally without the assistance of any kind of formal instruction or institutional guidance. What that means is the things that we're going to be concerned with cultural conservation, then, are those things which don't already have, how shall I say, they don't already have a framework for their continuance. The other types of culture, I guess I'd call the focus of cultural conservation as being on traditional culture. Those things which are handed down, they exist only in people's minds and actions and so forth. Two other areas of culture we could say would be popular culture and academic culture. And I think anyone would realize that popular culture is in pretty good shape. For one, the motivation of popular culture is primarily commercial interest, and because of its commercial interest, it automatically means that there are going to be artifacts and documentation of what occurred in popular culture, because that's what's sold, of course. Academic culture, there I'm referring to like classical music or art music. That's protected quite well in that we have institutions such as conservatories and universities which perpetuate and see to the transmission of that type of culture. But I don't think the traditional or the folklife type culture has adequate protection, and that's what cultural conservation is all about. One underlying assumption of cultural conservation is that it is somehow desirable to maintain these traditions, and that could be argued. I'll try to defend that later when I'm talking about fiddling, but that has to be an underlying assumption, just like with historic preservation. If people don't value the old buildings and the artifacts of culture, it's sort of a moot point whether you try to save them. If you can't get the community and people interested in saving them, it's probably not going to be worth your time. And so I'm going to try to explain later why I think it's valuable. Briefly, cultural conservation has two main thrusts. The first is preservation, and the second, encouragement. Preservation and encouragement have various facets to them. The reason that it's kind of a a variety of types of action taken for cultural conservation is because the types of things you're dealing with are so various. You know, everything from occupational skills to music to dance. You can see that there would be a lot of different types of action required to conserve such vastly different types of expression. Under preservation, we could list such things as planning, in other words, development of and coordination of plans and surveys, such as the survey I've been conducting. Documentation, recording, interviewing, taking photos, and so forth. And by the way, this report called out documentation as probably the most underutilized aspect of cultural conservation, or the most underutilized thing we can do to conserve traditional culture. The reason documentation is so important is that it gives tangible form to the intangible. In other words, if we make a tape of someone playing fiddle, for instance, we have a tangible object now which can be preserved beyond the time that person, let's say, they stop playing. We still have that record now. It's tangible. Maintenance refers to maintenance of collections, archives, and other important records. Under encouragement, and this is what I think is the most important and exciting aspect of cultural conservation, I perceive and I don't want to call it an older concept, but a previous concept of working with this type of material, just folklore. I see folklore concentrating mainly on documentation and scholarly description of traditional culture, and not so much on its encouragement within communities. And to me, that's a pretty exciting aspect of cultural conservation. Under encouragement, we have activities such as publication, which includes interpretive booklets, articles, discographies, bibliographies, newsletters, anything that gets information out to the public regarding traditional American culture. Public events like festivals, conventions, fiddle contests, for instance. These are really important, I think, because they provide a context for playing. I think, for instance, I'll try to explain later, but for fiddling in particular, if it weren't for fiddle contests, I think a lot of fiddlers in the state would have no place at all to play other than perhaps at home. The previously most important context, I think, was probably dancing, but there just aren't that many old-time dances going on that are left to play at anymore. Educational programs is the final aspect of encouragement, and that can include such things as, for instance, traditional arts apprenticeships, which pair would-be tradition bearers or young people interested in, let's say, fiddling, for instance, with a master player and try to encourage them to learn. Artisan residence programs, workshops, lectures, and so forth. That's cultural conservation then. Any activity directed at preserving traditional culture. I'll move on now and talk a little bit about fiddling. Does anybody have any question about that or comment? Okay. You can ask me any question you want about fiddling now. I'll try to answer. At least on fiddling I can make something up even if I wasn't sure of it. I did mention that fiddling is traditional music, and particularly in Missouri, we're real lucky to have senior or veteran fiddle players who are so willing to show what they know to younger people. That's where it's at really for conserving fiddling and keeping it alive, is transmitting it to another generation. That's what it's been all about. That's the basis of the whole tradition, is that people have learned in the past and were willing to teach others. They just didn't keep it unto themselves. What is the tradition of old-time fiddling? Well, maybe it'd be appropriate now. I've got written here, play a tune. So maybe I'll play a tune now. I brought my accompanist, John Stewart. He's going to help me out on the guitar. Wrong bow. Well, we'll play a tune that all the fiddlers here are surely familiar with, and it's one that's played pretty commonly around here. We'll play Marmaduke's Hornpipe, which is I guess you could call a square dance tune. play another tune here in a minute. But what is the origin of most of those tunes, or what are its roots based in? I said it was traditional, so it has to have existed in the past. Well, the primary origin, of course, of old-time fiddling, as played in Missouri and most of the rest of the country, is the British Isles. And although I think we could say that music is distinctly American, there's no doubt about it. There's considerable difference between the way the music is played in Ireland and England and Scotland and so forth. Still, again, the origin of the music, the way it's structured and the time and so forth is borrowed from that tradition. It came directly from that tradition. I think you could make a pretty strong case, however, for around the time of the Revolution, the kind of rejection of British culture and sort of an acceptance of some French elements, which, by the way, is where some scholars think square dancing comes from the French quadrilles. In fact, in square dancing, there are a lot of French words like sachet and allemand. Those are all French words borrowed from French quadrille calls. And so there's a strong French influence as well, I believe. But nonetheless, I do want to make the point that the music's distinctly American. Many tunes, it's been over 200 years now, of course, many tunes that are played, in fact, probably the majority of them, can't be traced to some early tune collection in England, for instance, say around, a 1700s type tune collection. There are tunes that were composed here, but they're still of the same tradition, or they're still the same form of music. There are a lot of fiddle players in Missouri, and there are quite a few of them here in this room, as a matter of fact. But I'm going to show you this map we developed as part of our survey. And a lot of people wonder, who are all these red dots are fiddlers. The blue ones are people like John who accompany people at fiddle contests, accompany fiddlers at fiddle contests, for instance. However, it's a little harder to identify the accompanists. So I'm not sure how many people I have on here right now. My last count on my list, though, with names and addresses of people I know who play the fiddle, is something on the order of 280 people. So you can see fiddling in Missouri is not in danger of dying out immediately, anyway. There's still a lot of people playing the music, and many more people interested, fans of fiddling, who follow fiddle contests and go to jam sessions and dances and so forth. If you notice, too, the Ozarks is underrepresented. That doesn't mean there aren't many fiddlers down there. That just means I don't know about them. So I'm sure we could fill this out if we just could get to that region as well. Okay. I do want to say something about variability in fiddling. Because it's a traditional art, let's see, I'm probably going to get in trouble here, but I think you could say that violinists tend to play more alike one another. I'm talking about violinists, classically trained or institutionally trained violinists, would have a tendency to play more alike one another than, say, two fiddlers. If you had two violinists and two fiddlers playing the same piece of music, I think you'd find the two violinists played more similarly to one another than the two fiddlers. And the reason being is that the violinists, their skill is a product of a very rigid, formalized system of learning, whereas fiddling, the fiddlers learn by imitation and or orally, and so what they're doing is based on their perception of whoever it was they learned from, and so there's more room for variability than, in fact, the variability does exist. There are, as I said, there are a lot of fiddle players in this room. We could get each one of them up and stand them here if they were willing and play Marmaduke's hornpipe, and you'd find that each one of them played it quite a bit different from one another. Although they're still following rules, it's not a freewheeling playing where you just play anything you want. Fiddlers follow rules, but the rules aren't quite the same kind of rules that a violinist would follow, for instance. The variations can occur both in the repertoire, I guess, in the techniques they use. You're going to catch me all little spelling lessons. And in execution. somewhat arbitrary terms I use to describe different elements of fiddle playing, but repertoire refers to the kinds of tunes they play, and you'll find from one region to the next in the state and from one fiddler to the next. Some fiddlers play, for instance, might play a lot of hoedowns or square dance tunes and a few waltzes, and they might not know any tunes, for instance, which we could call 6/8 tunes or Schottisches. There's a great variability in the kind of tunes that fiddlers play from one part of the state to the next. Also, within a certain kind of tune, like, for instance, hoedowns or square dance tunes, we might see certain square dance tunes being played in one area of the state, and they might not know them somewhere else. Like, I know there's a lot of tunes that are played here in Boone County that aren't played anywhere else in the state, for instance. And so that's, again, a result of the growth of the tradition in the local area. Those lights are warm. Techniques. Well, let's see. Let me back up and play some more tunes to give you examples of the repertoire or different kinds of tunes. We played a square dance tune. We'll play another one just to give you an example. Typical square dance tune called Soldier's Joy. Play a waltz now. That's another kind of tune that's commonly played. I'll play Cowboy Another kind of tune that you don't hear quite so much is tunes in 6/8 time, sometimes called quadrilles or jigs. I think the Irish call them jigs. Mostly in Missouri, they just call them 6/8ers or 6/8 tunes. But it's sort of like type of tune that you hear, this will be the last kind of tune I'll play, but there are many others. There's a Schottische. And I should mention, too, that the tunes correspond to different dances. As I said, the hoedowns, and also we include breakdowns, reels, and hornpipes in Missouri are for square dancing, waltz for waltzing, of course. That particular tune I've seen danced two ways, and it's pretty rare to even hear somebody play those. One was a man doing kind of a solo jig step to that 6/8 tune. He lived up in Audrain County, and then I heard someone else say that you could two-step to those. So you might try to imagine two-stepping to Irish Washerwoman or something. You know how that would work or not. Here's a Schottische now. Under techniques, those are different kinds of tunes. Under techniques, there are a number of things. For instance, whether or not they use vibrato, a fiddler might use vibrato. In other words, kind of wiggling your finger to give a sweeter sound. But here again, this isn't like a vibrato like a violinist might use. I'm not a musicologist, so I can't analyze the differences for you, but it's quite a bit different. And you can usually, having judged a few fiddle contests, if you hear a violinist playing in the fiddle contest, that's usually what will give them away as having been trained. They can't not do, it seems like, the real classical slow vibrato. And some fiddlers use this, however, and some just leave their fingers flat on the fingerboard and don't bother to make that motion. Another thing is use of double stops or playing two strings at once. This can, for instance, making chords like this. That can vary from one region to the next and also from one tune to the next. Some tunes you might use that on and some tunes you might not. Various things about fingering, placement of the fingers to get certain notes and so forth, but that would take an incredible amount of analysis to ever do anything with, and I'm not sure what the value of it might be. Bowing, there are many ways to bow, and here again, if you watch violinists, if you watch on PBS, for instance, watch an orchestra, or you go over here to Jesse Hall and hear the orchestra, all the bows will be moving together with one another. Well, if you go to the fiddle contest or somewhere where a lot of fiddlers are playing, you'll see the bows going in every direction, and they'll all be playing the same tune, which kind of proves there's more than one way to skin a cat. There are many ways to approach playing that same tune. On execution, I would just list things like tempo, how fast they play the tune, for instance, and generally speaking, fiddlers in the north part of Missouri do not play quite so fast as fiddlers in the Ozarks, and that also, fiddling is sort of intertwined with dancing. And so the square dancing, by the same virtue, is faster and tighter in the Ozarks than it is, for instance, up in North Missouri, where it's a little bit more graceful. They take a little wider swings, and they're just moving through the figures a little bit more slowly. Tone, just what's the desirable tone to produce? How beautiful a sound is it necessary to produce? Some fiddlers and some traditions require, to be able to play that, require producing a very beautiful tone, particularly for playing in contests now. That's sort of the thing. Others, tone isn't quite such an important element. And finally, rhythmic accent. What kind of syncopation or rhythm is used? And I'm not talking about the notated rhythm, but the rhythm that the fiddler puts into the bowing and the whole performance of the tune. That tends to vary from one region to the next and from one fiddler to the next as well. Finally, I should, Finally, I should mention different performance settings. I already alluded to that a little bit. Fiddlers play at home, of course. I play at home all the time. I'm sure a lot of people at home trying to learn new tunes, work things out. Jam sessions where people just get together and play. There's sort of an informal setting. Fiddle contests, which I guess as far as public performances goes, that's the most important place that the fiddle is played now, is a fiddle contest. Last year in Missouri there were over 50 such events scattered out all over the state, and you can, in the summertime, pick one up about any weekend. Sometimes if you had a plane, you could travel to 3 or 4 in the same day. It's just be a matter of getting between them. And dances, there are a lot of different dances going on still. They're a little bit harder to find, but they're still out there. In fact, it's heartening to see how many old-time dances are still going on. And there again, it's something that takes a lot of community effort that's not motivated from the outside. The communities keep those kinds of things going. Just want to mention what I believe, I guess, is threatening fiddling, and finally say why I think it's important to preserve it. I think one of the most, the thing threatening old-time fiddle styles or old-time fiddle playing today is the fact that the younger fiddlers I see don't tend to get with the older fiddlers and try to learn what I guess I would call the right way to play the different tunes. Instead, they tend to be more influenced by media, and particularly records. There's almost, I guess you could say, a national fiddle style that's developed in the last 10 or 12 years, which is being heard now all over the country, and it's sort of blurring and covering over the local styles. So, for instance, I like to relate the anecdote that I was up at a contest in Hannibal a couple of years ago, and someone said, "Hey, the Pennsylvania State champion is here." I thought, well, boy, this is going to be great. This is going to be really interesting. I've never heard a fiddler from Pennsylvania, and you automatically suspect that someone from that far away would play considerably different than anything you'd ever heard before. Well, it just so happens this was a young guy who had learned all this stuff off a Mark O'Connor record. I don't know if you're familiar with Mark O'Connor. He's kind of the idol of all the young fiddlers. And he played just like that. And that's nothing against his choice to play like that, because he did choose, that's where he chose to learn his tunes. I just think perhaps in the process he might have glossed over somebody locally that he could have learned some things from as well. And I think that's what has to be the main thrust of the cultural conservation of fiddling in terms of encouragement. We have to encourage somehow the young fiddlers to get with the older fiddlers, the veterans who really know how to play the old way, and encourage them to learn the style of playing. You could make the case, well, why don't we just record the old guys, and then anytime, years from now, they could learn to play those tunes. But that's not actually the case. You can do a fairly good job learning from a tape, but you can't get it all. There's a lot more than just the hearing. There's the watching and seeing the techniques used in producing the sound. And it's the whole idea of imitation. I think, to me, that's where the thrust has to be in terms of protecting and conserving local fiddle traditions. Now, it's been argued, in fact, John and I have argued about this a little bit, by getting in here and encouraging people to learn to play the fiddle, for instance, from someone locally rather than off records. Well, aren't we interfering with exactly the same process and tampering with the process that permitted fiddling to come down to the present day? In other words, the natural evolution of the thing, no one years ago was trying to encourage people to get with others and learn to play the fiddle. It was its natural evolution that it came down to us in the present day. And if we get in there and try to encourage and direct people, aren't we tampering then with the same process which allowed us to have fiddling here to enjoy today? And that might be true. It is the true, I guess, what you'd call the folk process, people unconsciously hearing what they like and learning that. However, in the past, we didn't have the hard sell and the glamour of the media influencing people to learn to play. They learned to play, and this is somewhat a generalization, it's not entirely true, but they learned to play in relative isolation from those kinds of elements. That's what allowed distinct regional styles of fiddle playing to develop, because people didn't communicate from one region to the next quite so much, and they didn't have all these records and things to listen to. I don't want to say that the change is inevitable, but I think it can be and should be slowed. And I guess not slowed maybe isn't the right word, but tempered. We need to temper this influence of the media. It's like, let's see if I can come up with an analogy here. It might be kind of a weird one, but if we had an old house we were living in, and it had served us in good stead for a couple hundred years, and then someone came along selling paper tents. They're very beautiful. They're colored finely, and we purchased one of these tents and we set it beside the old house. And while we're sleeping in this paper tent and we're having a very nice time, well, the old house burns down and it's gone. And then all we got left is this kind of paper tent, and pretty soon it's torn and tattered because it was just kind of a fad anyway. It wasn't meant to last very long. And so the roots or the base of the whole tradition, the house, is gone, and we're stuck with this kind of funky-looking paper tent, which I think is what we're going to end up with, perhaps, if the young people playing the fiddle don't get interested in the old styles. It's okay, I think, to vary and to expand and explore different areas of music and to include them, perhaps, in old-time fiddling. But unless you've got a base, a solid base in the tradition, I just don't think it's going to be quite as the same. I don't think it's going to be quite as desirable. Finally, I think one final point, and this is finally, I think that fiddling has a place in our society, and the idea of old-time fiddling and its preservation simply from the fact that it helps us find ourselves. It's another one of those things that helps us find ourselves in time and space, sort of. Protects us against the anxiety or feeling that we have no past, and somehow that affects our impression of the future and how we feel about ourselves today. I know for myself, I'm very proud to have learned to play the fiddle from people that I really respect, some veteran fiddlers, and I'm very proud to know that under my stewardship, those tunes I've learned, I'm going to carry on, into the 20th century, and I hope somebody, or in the 21st century, and I hope somebody will try to learn them from me someday as well. And I just think it gives one a sense of pride and a sense of community to realize that you're part of an unbroken strand that goes back, countless generations. It goes back several hundred years. That's the end of my prepared remarks. If you have any questions, I'll entertain them then. Yeah.
I got one of those that's different behind by a rock or something. What kind of maybe challenge one of your statements?
Go ahead.
To the effect that you're blaming what I think maybe a term we can agree on, which is kind of homogenization of fiddling into a national style on media. Well, I've been going to fiddle contests off and on in Missouri for about 15 years, and my sense of it is that a lot of the problem comes from the so-called sanctioned fiddle contests, where if you do not adopt what we might call the Texas leisure style of fiddling, for one of the better words, you don't stand a chance of winning. Even your gas money to get there. Now, I know a lot of old-time fiddlers in Missouri, some of who are no longer with us, who really had no use for any of these sanctioned contests. They might enter some of their local neighborhood contests, because though they were fine fiddlers and they were very steeped in the Missouri tradition, they were not recognized by, as even being, quote, old-time fiddlers.
Yeah.
Am I off base?
No, not at all. Media, I guess I didn't really expand on that the way I could have. Media, yeah, you're right. Media is only one aspect or one effect. The other would be these kinds of things, these sanctioned fiddle contests in particular. That's what's happening through sort of a national fiddle organization that's loosely organized, but they're sanctioning big money, high publicity, high profile contests around the country, and they are, through their hidden cultural agenda, perpetuating or bringing to the fore this modern style of fiddle playing, this progressive style of fiddle playing. And I think related to that, key to that is also just people's freedom to travel now. Missouri fiddler, a young guy here in Missouri learning to play the fiddle, people, if they want to play that style, they can travel now to where that style is popular. And you find at these big contests, people have traveled 1,500 miles to go to a fiddle contest. It's just incredible. There'll be people from Georgia and Canada and everywhere. It's really astounding how far people will go now to play in one of these contests like you're talking about.
So you and I guess, don't have any real disagreement.
Not at all, no. Yeah.
Bill, what you look for and what Charlie would endorse too is a way to encourage players of styles that are not currently in vogue. We all can't be Mark O'Connor or even Charlie Walden, who represents only one of many styles traditional in Missouri. When I worked at the Smithsonian Fiddle Contest for several years, we developed a special category in the prizes. Actually, we had two categories where we gave cash prizes to, first of all, the most interesting rendition of a traditional tune, bar none in style. And secondly, we gave a special prize to the most archaic, if you will, authentic regional style. This, of course, is a matter of taste by the judges, but we had these little debates about it. And we found that in a contest where there were over 100 contestants, there was a tremendous amount of interest among the older players in brushing up on their old-fashioned way of playing Maggie's Drawers or whatever it is, in order to get around having to imitate the Hornpipe fiddlers or the Weaver fiddlers. And you guys might try that in your own contest. Bring special recognition to people who have a perhaps unique rendition of an old tune or who represent an archaic regional style, and give them a special prize. Make them proud of it instead of feeling like, gee whiz, I can't play fast enough, so I'm not even going to hit it.
Yeah.
Do you have some examples of regional, people you've collected?
Oh yeah, hey, I cut off before I said all my stuff, didn't I? All I've got here is I bought a wire recorder, and I know what I was going to talk about now. I was going to talk about what's been done to conserve fiddling in Missouri. Yeah, that's right. That was what this was all about, wasn't it? Yeah. Yes.
On your flyer, you have a black fiddler.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about the ethnic diversity in Missouri in terms of fiddling style and what you've done in collecting and this ethnic diversity?
Sure.
And what are the differences and how that's alive?
Okay. First off, I'd say that the main ethnic core of fiddling is Anglo-Americans or people of Scottish and English and Irish descent. That's the main ethnic core of fiddling. But related to that, we have influence from other groups, and in Missouri that's really true. Particularly, for instance, as I was going to mention, I'll go ahead now. There's a strong French influence in one region in Missouri. And here again, these influences, I do want to say they're influences. It's not different styles of music. It's still primarily old fiddle tunes and that same kind of music, but with a different twist to it. And I'll hold this up. This album produced by Missouri Friends of the Folk Arts, right? I always get that mixed up. Barry Burgess here, he had a hand in producing this, but this is probably the only recording of French fiddle styles that's available for public sale. But it has a Missouri French fiddle player on it from Washington County. By the same token, there are a lot of German, or there are some German fiddlers in Missouri, and besides playing a few hoedowns, they play a lot of the couple. probably because there were a lot of blacks in those regions anyway, because that was a plantation area and there were slaves. In fact, Bill Caton is the son of Missouri-born slaves. He's now dead. I haven't yet to identify anybody living who's a black fiddler, and so there's a whole legacy lost. Essentially, I really don't think you're going to find anybody living, black people living, who play old-time fiddle, but there were a lot of them, and the influence is there. Yeah. Oh yeah, let me go ahead and finish my address. Okay. I did want to mention some things that have been done in Missouri already to conserve old-time fiddling and to keep it alive. And these things all fall under those various headings, which I won't bother to list for you again, under preservation and encouragement. One important thing, I think, and under documentation and publication, is the publication of tune collections. And Missouri can boast 4 tune collections published by Missourians in Missouri. And there's a 5th one coming up, which I'll talk about. At any rate, we can go all the way back to 1927 when we had a bumper crop year. There were 2 collections published in Missouri that year. One, Old-Time Violin Melodies by W.H. Morris, published in St. Joseph in 1927. And one thing about tune books, fiddle tune books, a lot of fiddle tune books are merely rip-offs of 19th century tune collections. In other words, they take plates and tunes from other tune collections and compile them together, and they say, here's John Doe's collection of old-time fiddling tunes. Well, you look through it and find it's already stuff that's been published. But the exciting thing about this Morris book is his use of the term quadrille. And for one thing, I haven't found many of these tunes in other collections. For another thing, he uses the term quadrille to describe tunes in 6/8 time. And it just so happens, if there were anywhere in Missouri where that term was going to be used, it'd be in northwest Missouri, up around St. Joe. So that leads me to be hopeful that these are actually collected tunes and represent the style, the tunes of that region, rather than something he ripped off from an earlier tune collection. Published the same year in St. Louis was E.F. Adams' Old Time Fiddler's Favorite Barn Dance Tunes. These are both Xerox copies of these. I've never seen an original of the Morris book. This was one I got from R.P. Christensen, who he had got it from the Library of Congress as a Xerox also. I don't know if there might not be any originals left. But anyway, this is Old Time Fiddler's Favorite Barn Dance Tunes, published in 1927. Some of Adams' tunes are a little bit more suspect of being taken from earlier tune collections. So he needs some checking into it, I guess. A real important book is Traditional Music in America, published in 1940. Ira Ford's the author. This is a reprint. It's now available again as a reprint at the Capo Press in New York. But this is actually, supposedly, collected tunes. There are some tunes in here which do smack of being taken out of tune books, but there are a lot that aren't. In fact, he actually lists, this is the first tune book of this earlier era where he actually lists his informants, in other words, the people he got the tunes from. He tells you what their names were and so forth. So that leads me to believe that this is a pretty reliable source of Missouri fiddle tunes. Finally, the most recent, and I think probably, to my mind, probably the most important tune collection of this century, I think, bar none, is the Old Time Fiddler's Repertory by R.P. Christensen, published here by the University of Missouri Press. This is the paper version. It's had 3 printings already in hardbound. They've gone to paper finally. But this is a fantastic collection of tunes, and they're all, he can tell you who he got them from. There aren't any tunes from any books here. He collected these. He got these from people who he was associated with in the late 40s and early 50s. And what this thing is here is a wire recorder, courtesy of Mr. Pollybury, who's here today, of the type that Christensen used in collecting the tunes that are in that book. He would go around and record the fiddlers with this wire recorder, and then transcribe the tunes onto paper, and they were later published in that book. Recordings issued. That's an important thing. Most fiddlers, by the way, don't read music. So you wonder, well, what good is all these tune books? But it just so happens, and I've asked Mr. Christensen that, what good is a tune book to preserve old-time fiddling, except maybe for scholars, you know, who can, or musicologists who might want to analyze these and print it in something, some dissertation that no one would ever read. What good is it beyond that? Well, it is good in that he told me one night he got a call late from a man in Virginia one night, and the guy said, "Boy, I really like your tune book." The guy called him up and he said, "I really like your tune book." And he said, "Well, you read music?" The guy said, "No, can't read a note." But he said, "My daughter or granddaughter, I can't remember which, plays the melodies on the right hand on a piano for him, and he's learning from her that way." So the music is getting to fiddlers. But we find also that, and I think mainly because of the influence of string, or not string music programs so much, but any kind of band program in schools. There are a few people my age and younger who haven't had some influence by a school band of some type. For instance, I played tuba for the Marching Hallsville Indians. We marched in the homecoming parade several times here. And that's how I can read music. That's how I learned to read music. And when I started playing the fiddle, well, I just figured out, well, heck, I can take what I know about reading music and apply it to the fiddle. And I think you'll find that a lot more young fiddlers can read music now than older fiddlers. That doesn't mean they've taken, you know, they're not necessarily studying the violin, they just happen to have picked it up somewhere else. Recordings issued. There's I have a real problem with recordings issued. The Missouri and the whole Midwest seem to have been ignored in the early days of recording when the 78s were being reissued, like in the 20s and 30s. And I'm not sure what the reason is. I wouldn't even want to speculate. But we don't have much of a record of music of that era. Whereas in the Southeast, there were just tons and tons of 78 RPM records issued of fiddlers in that region. We don't have much in Missouri. There have been a few 78s. In fact, Spence Galloway, who's a collector of 78s, has some Missouri 78s, but they're pretty late, aren't they? 40s. Yeah. So we don't have any really early record of fiddlers on recordings, but there have been some recordings recently. Again, a companion to this Christensen fiddle book is this record, which I think is excellent. It's wire recordings. These wire recordings he used to transcribe the tunes available on a two-record set, University of Missouri Press. I already mentioned the Missouri Friends of the Folk Arts album, which isn't all fiddling, but it does have some very good fiddling on it. Recently, a fiddler in Springfield, Art Galbraith, has been picked up by Rounder Records. He's now got 2 records out. To me, that's probably the first instance of a commercial record concern actually seriously picking up a Missouri fiddler and doing anything with him at all. But most importantly, I think with recordings are people like Pete McMahon, who, at their own expense, produce records, you know, I guess you'd call them vanity pressings, but whatever you want to call them, they're an important record of fiddle playing in Missouri, and there are a lot of Missouri fiddlers who've done this. The records are kind of hard to get a hold of. You have to meet the guy at a fiddle contest and ask him if he brought any of his records with him. You can't buy them at the record store. But that, I can't underscore, you know, how important that contribution is. There aren't any real books on Missouri fiddling yet. I guess you'd call this Traditional Music of America the closest thing to a book on fiddling. It does have quite a bit of text in the front. We hope someday someone will write a book on Missouri fiddling. There have been a few articles of varying significance done, and some of them have been pretty good. Let's see. I'm going to have to run down through this quite quickly here. Another important effort at cultural conservation of fiddling is fiddlers associations, and there were a few years ago, I think about 3 years ago, in 1981, there were 4 fiddlers associations in Missouri, all at the same time. You wonder why they weren't all under one umbrella. I had somebody tell me once, let's see, there's always going to be a fight in Missouri if people get together and try to form a group, and I guess that's why there hasn't been a real state fiddlers association. But anyway, those groups are active, and they do make an important contribution, particularly in terms of encouraging fiddling. Field recordings and documentation to me, are probably the most important thing that has been done and still needs to be done to preserve old-time fiddling in Missouri. As I mentioned, Christensen recording fiddlers in Missouri with the wire recorder. Also, Alan Lomax and Max Hunter, Vance Randolph, important folklorists of the Midwest, have recorded Missouri fiddlers. And now a list has been issued, by the way, of recordings by those collectors in the Library of Congress, and hopefully we want to someday acquire those and bring them back to Missouri so people here in Missouri can use them. More recently, people like Gordon McCann in Springfield, who's done, if you see this guy anywhere where there's fiddlers, he has a tape recorder running constantly. I'd hate to have to edit all his stuff, but I know he's got a lot of good material on there, as well as talking and so forth. He's tried to, I guess, record every aspect of the tradition that way. And there are many hobby fiddle recorders about. In fact, some of the best recordings that our Fiddlers Association has gotten have been from hobby fiddle recorders. In other words, people that at some point bought a tape recorder and they loved fiddling, and they would go record people. And a man that comes to mind in Fulton has a vast storehouse in a little cabinet in his bedroom of just what are priceless recordings of now deceased Missouri fiddle players. And there are people like this all over the state, and they've made a real important contribution. What needs to be done now is identify these collections and copy them and put them in some kind of central repository so that they can be preserved. Such a repository does exist. The Missouri State Old Time Fiddlers Association has established an archive of fiddle recordings and other related materials here at Western Historical Manuscripts here on campus. You can walk in there right now, or right after we're done here, and you can listen to Uncle Bob Walters playing tunes. You can go in there and look in the card catalog and find the fiddler of your choice. Of course, not everybody's in there yet, but we hope to someday get as many fiddlers represented in that collection as possible. Would like to mention our fiddle contest calendar, which is produced annually as well. I think this has made it important. This is put out by the Missouri State Old Time Fiddlers Association, and it's made an important contribution in that it disseminates information about fiddle contests. I think the rise we've seen in attendance in fiddle contests in the last couple of years can in some measure be attributed to the availability of the information. Finally, programs at the center, I'd like to mention just a few. One, of course, is the survey which brought me here before you today. I've been working on for the last 10 months recording. We now have quite an archive of recordings of people that I don't think we would have recorded otherwise if there hadn't been the money available to do the traveling and so forth. Also, in the works is a potential apprenticeship program which, as I mentioned before, would match qualified apprentices, people with the desire to learn to play the old music, with a identified master fiddle player. And that, to me, is a really exciting possibility, should that go through. Also, the touring program at the center, which can, if the instance occurs that some community would want to hire fiddlers to play, could bring fiddlers to different communities in Missouri to perform. And finally, I'd like to let you know about our WOS Radio Reunion and Fiddling Championship, which we have tentatively planned for October. WOS Radio was a station which broadcast from the Capitol building in the 1920s. It just so happens that over that station they broadcast just hundreds and hundreds of hours of old-time fiddling. That was the main, most popular music on that station. And now we would like to do a program at the Capitol to commemorate those contributions. And should that be funded, that will be in October. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. We have a lot of fiddlers here.